Live with our 228th episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on Twitter, joined by my co-host Seth Law at Seth Law on Twitter. Seth, say hi. Or sorry, X now. Seth, say hi.
Hey everyone! Apparently, we've rolled Elon Musk back, so there you go. Thanks to Ken. Welcome to another episode. Excited to have the Chime team with us, David and Paul. We'll do introductions shortly with them to talk about Monocle and their experience over there because it is very relevant to what we're seeing in the industry and what we run into. So, on top of that, just from an announcements perspective. KernelCon for next year. That's going to be the next place that you're going to be able to do or take practical secure code review. You will see the new AI portions of that. Ken and I are working behind the scenes to include some of the LLM and some of the other things that we've been doing in our own practices for code reviews and using those AI elements. So if you're going to be at KernelCon or you're looking for an opportunity to take practical secure code review, that's going to be your next chance. As of right now, there might be something else that pops up. We got a couple other CFPs or CFTs that we've entered into. And otherwise, we will be at CactusCon. I think KernelCon's in April. CactusCon is in February. They don't have training, but we will be there if you'd like to see us in person. Outside of that, Ken, I don't think I have anything else. I know we've been excited to get the Chime team on, David and Paul. So, Ken, is there anything else you want to announce before you do introductions?
I guess the only thing I'll remind people is last week I had kind of teased out that we are now in open beta at Dryrun, so you can go to app.dryrun.security if you'd like to try it out, and we'll activate your account after we do a little vetting, but it's pretty quick. Beyond that, no, I am really excited. Ever since I saw the series, and we'll get into it, from Chime, engineers on the Monocle platform, I was fascinated to hear more. Lots of questions. It was more one of those things where you look at it and you say, okay, this is where we should be going. As an industry, I really liked the approach, loved the approach, and really wanted to have Paul and David on. But we'll get into that in a second. Seth, I think that's it for me. Any other, anything else that you need to go through before we just roll into it?
Nope. Let's go ahead and jump into it. Right. And I think, Ken, do you want to run through the introductions there, or how do you want to do this?
Yeah. So
go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. No. Okay. So I'll just start with introductions, and I have to be honest with you. David, I was able to find a little bit of information on your background, but Paul, it was a little bit harder. But so David, it seems like David Trejo, it seems like your background's more in engineering, actually. Paul. I'm going to try and say this right. Paul Kalinowitz, is that?
Yeah, very good.
Okay, all right. I want to make sure we get that right. Paul, it seemed like your background was more security, but David, it seemed like your background was a little bit more on the engineering side of things. So I could be completely off here, but David, I'll hand it over to you to kind of talk a little bit about your background and give some more specifics there.
Sure thing, yeah. I used to be on a growth engineering team, and in your free time, you build some tools that make people more productive. And I switched over to a developer experience team. And then that's when we built a version of Monocle at my previous company that, even though we weren't on the security team was our biggest sponsor. So that's how I got started in this area. And it's pretty fun to build for internal teams because everybody has strong opinions about what they want, and you get that product development feedback loop right there in Slack, which is just very satisfying for me, at least.
I'm sure there's lots of lessons that you learned about working with security folks, and I'm certain we'll get into that. There are, of course, like a lot of considerations when you're building for security, but especially a product kind of focus approach to security, which is Well, again, we'll get into that. But Paul, I did want to just real quick, because so when I looked you up, it's actually I say that there's not a lot. No, there is actually a lot of technical sort of things that I found about you, but in terms of your career path, that was actually harder to find. So you've had a lot of input on different forums. You seem to have like I think I went back as far as I could be wrong here, but maybe even 13 years of pretty serious technical contributions I could find at least online. But again, if you could like maybe elaborate on your kind of career path to this point.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've had a pretty low profile online generally for a while now, but yeah, I started off my career working for the government doing information assurance. So like, doing security reviews of different projects that were going on, but kind of like hands off from the actual technical work that I had been doing, when I was in college. And after a while for that, got, an itch to get back into the actual more hands-on stuff. As far as hands-on as you can be like in software where everything's like non-physical and that. So went back to the private sector, moved to the Midwest. I was working at PayPal for a while. And then, after several years working there, I moved over to Chime, both there and here, on information security teams. And, at Chime, we're focused, our team is focused on building out tooling to support information security things for, internal use, like Monocle is a great example of that.
Interesting. Yeah, that's yeah, that kind of that makes a lot of sense and lines up with what I could find online. Yeah, I mean, it seems like the two of you definitely have like deep roots in understanding David from your side, understanding sort of like how to build for it seems like to me anyways for enjoyment. Honestly, this seemed like something that was actually somewhat fun to use for developers. And then Paul, yeah, it seems like you have very deep roots in the technical space, and Monocle for sure demonstrates deep technical prowess. And so I think maybe Seth, I don't know where you want to start here, but probably just talking about what is Monocle would make the most sense for those that are unfamiliar with the platform, and then we can kind of roll from there.
Yeah, and I'll post the first link here because that's a good, kind of introduction to it for those that haven't read about Monocle yet. I know, and I'll let David and Paul speak to it, right? Like my initial takeaway here, and one of the things that I loved was just the approach from a product security perspective. And I think it's in the first couple paragraphs in that article, the security philosophy about how security is promoting this positive culture, and the development of Monocle backs up like a security philosophy that is, hey, we're a partner with the development. We're trying to get out of the way. We're trying to enable the development organization to actually do security things and to do it quickly and efficiently. So maybe let's start there, right? Like David, you talked about like developing something similar to Monocle at a previous organization or in a previous life. How did that pitch go? How did that start at Chime? And then, where did it go from there? So we'll start there, David.
Yeah, so at least at Chime, we were very lucky because our biggest sponsor for the project at the previous company, Jeff Trudeau, joined Chime as the chief security officer. And then some of his hires were like, we just can't really get our stuff done without having a tool like this. So, how about we just build it again? And so then, of course, that's pretty easy for us to get started because we've already got, buy-in from chief security officer. So that's basically how it started here at Chime. And I would say the prototyping process, depending on how good you are at cutting down your requirements and what you're building, that can actually be pretty quick and pretty fun as well. So I basically joined and started prototyping almost immediately and, showed people things and went from there.
So along those lines, what were your first security requirements, right? Like, I mean, we always kind of start basic with, okay, this is what we're trying to accomplish. I mean, I know coming into it from kind of a third party consulting perspective, when I step into organizations, this is what they struggle with is, hey, we want the end goal. Like you have Monocle up and running and you have it monitoring all these code bases and all the developers are chimed in. But when you step into Chime or step into an organization where that doesn't exist, what was the initial vision? What was the first requirement that you had?
Yeah, I would say that the beginning things that you build are things that help with audits. So the types of checks that we add are things like, do you have at least one branch protection rule set up? Basically, that you've got one review, at least one code review, and it's not the person who wrote the PR. And then that alone can save a lot of time, because you can imagine in these audits, they sample, say, 100 repos, and then you've got to go click through the admin settings for all of those repos to know, does it have things set up correctly? So I think I mentioned this in the article, but depending on how many audits you're doing, if you're planning to IPO someday, then you've got more audits to do. Then that could be like potentially 2,000 hours of engineering time, somebody who actually knows how to click through GitHub in the right way to check on all those things. So, that's basically a full-time engineer.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. Yeah. Go ahead, Ken. Sorry.
Well, I was going to say that resonates with me. Because I don't think I've explained too much of my background to you two. So I left my job at GitHub, but I was there so I left there about 9 months ago, but I was there for almost 6 years. And I went through these pains, right? So that's why when I saw Monocle, I was like, oh yes, exactly. So on the auditing note, and I tell people this all the time, and I've said it on the podcast a bunch, one of the biggest pain points that we had was that people would come in, these auditors would come in and they'd say, okay, well, you say that you do, for example, you do, without giving away too much, you do security reviews of things that fall within a certain criteria. And you say that those reviews have, some process that handles follow-up. Cool. I'm going to take a random sample from your released roadmap, and then I'm going to say, okay, well, here's the features that you mentioned here. So those become random throughout the year. They'll look at the feature log and see like what we actually ship. They'll pick out those features, and then from there it becomes finding random samplings of doing all the things that we said that we are supposed to do against those random, even further randomized examples of different features that we released. And it becomes this just insanely difficult to wrangle process that we had an entire team dedicated to wrangling, and then they pulled in all these different folks. And then in terms of automation, it was kind of like trying to really, because we were GitHub and we operated on GitHub, so it's searching literally GitHub for the answers to these things, and that just takes an incredible amount of time. So you have that one pain point that this solves, that's a massive pain point, which is the tracking up. Because one of the blog posts talks about how you if someone accepts a risk, because you do this thing of warning, more warning, and more like, hey, here's some potential risks and here's some potential follow-ups you could take. But people do have the option of accepting those risks, and then tickets can be created once those risks are accepted. So immediately you have like that auditing paperwork log and stream kind of handle. So that's the one big thing that I took away from that. Like, yes, that really helps. The other being that whole thing of like back to the warnings is like we as an industry are talking a lot about right now getting off the hamster wheel. I've seen so many headlines from different newsletters I follow and different tweets with blogs and videos and everything where they talk about this. And that hamster wheel is the scan and fix approach, right? Like you can't ship software unless it's been scanned, and then we had some whatever like findings come out of it of whatever criticality, and then like those have to be resolved. That's not the approach that you took. It did seem like you're warning on, really high risk vulnerabilities, or having, being I don't know if you blocked. Actually, that's a question. I don't know if you blocked on those high or if it was still just a warning, but it seemed like that was, you're like, no, only if it's really, really risky do we take more significant action.
Yeah. So just briefly, like the first bunch of stuff we built was basically just reading from GitHub and then displaying information. And then our that's like the first big part of the project. And then the second big part of the project is monitoring pull requests that, like, at the moment they're being merged, are they risky, so to speak? For example, like they didn't have the pull request approval. I know nobody looked at it. One single engineer is deciding to merge. And then we see that and we create a Jira ticket to track. And someone will go follow up on that and look to make sure that the code looks fine. And, you know, hey, engineer, next time get a code review, please. Right. So, yeah. So in general, our security leadership has been extremely supportive of looking at just the most important things, because the status quo before you start any work is just that nothing is getting looked at, right? I mean, just naively, if you have no security program, right, nothing's getting looked at. So I would say it makes a ton of sense just to start with criticals and highs and not overwhelm engineers, not overwhelm ourselves. And then if you're doing great on those, then you can start looking at the other ones. But of course, probably you actually have even more important stuff to look at, and you probably don't want to invest in mediums and lows unless they're really easy, like merging dependabot pull requests for those.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like that it's not just the pull request code changing either. I like that your platforms, so that's one part of it, and that's a super critical part of it, not just for actual security, but especially for change control. So from an actual security perspective and an auditing perspective, that's amazing. The other thing that I think really was what really kind of just became this neat idea was when I saw it, was the idea of pulling in all of these different attributes. So you're looking at things like Docker images and you know, are you keeping up with Dependabot, or you know, your dependencies? I assume it's Dependabot. I'm actually just saying
Yeah,
that.
Dependabot, because thankfully we get to use GitHub. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't want to just put it out there and be wrong, but it's like Docker and Dependabot and things like your actual configuration, like your branch protection rules. It's a whole bunch of other factors, and I'm curious where the idea to do that, or you know, sort of how that came about. Because yeah, I'm huge fan of that. I think there's a lot more risk than just the code that's changing.
Yeah, I think some of that comes from, so you start off maybe with like a repository view, and then you realize that in the course of your day-to-day security work, you need to see like, oh, what are all the images we're using? And so then you need like a reverse view where you can see the individual facts mapped back to the repositories. So that view becomes pretty helpful and useful for security engineers and AppSec people on a, let's say, daily basis, maybe, depending on what their work is and whether their initiative is tracked in Monocle or not.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. I mean, it's cool how it, like, you know, you're looking at the attributes, but you like followed up with the, you know, the risky pull requests after, but it seems like it started from a general hygiene perspective. And I did, like we've talked a lot with David, I did want to ask Paul specifically, like what his experience was, how he got involved with the project. And then, you know, then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so I came onto the project to help David build out, you know, some of the more advanced capabilities. Right now, it's like David said, started out like, oh, you just look at GitHub, get some information, present it more usefully.
Okay.
Some of the features we have now like involve correlating data from a lot of different data sources, and like having like a more complex like rule that you're looking for.
Okay.
So like, yeah, for example, like there's a lot of interest around like the rollout of some of the new security capabilities our team is developing. And Monocle is like a pretty good way of trying to track that rollout. So you can see like we have this new feature like for how we authenticate services with each other. How many services have adopted that or are enforcing that? That's something we can measure in Monocle, and then like eventually add that to their score, so we can measure over time. Start off like almost everything's failing because it's brand new, and then as we migrate things, we can see the progress we're making across all our services, and also see if anything backslides, like the numbers will shift the other way. But checks like that, like it's more complex than just querying GitHub for some information. We're digging into like how we're deploying services, like sometimes how their CI is set up, what's happening like in the CD environment, and like bringing all that information together, figure out, okay, this service is configured to enforce this thing when it's deployed.
Okay.
And if it's not, like we can say like, oh, like you need also give more actionable information to the developers, saying not just like, oh, you need to do this like new feature. It's here's where you're at in the process of onboarding. Here's the next steps to work on.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it feels like, you started with this high level of, okay, we query GitHub. We're able to check like a couple of things about pull requests, but now you're starting to dig deeper into the code specifically on, hey, it looks like we've got like a new authorization feature, right? And this is one of the, the keys to improving a program just generally is you start small, start with the easy wins, right? Like, yes, is everything onboarded to a, static analyzer, or it's running Dependabot, you're accepting those requests, all that kind of stuff, that the general housekeeping. But the second that we start to introduce those more advanced features, these sorts of dashboards and tools become very specific to an organization, right? So it would be hard to take Monocle and go like, for me talking to a third party, right? Like I can't tell them, hey, go use Monocle on your code base, because the features that they've written into their code aren't necessarily going to line up with what what Chime has done. Correct?
Yeah, exactly. And like we've had some discussions internally about trying to open source Monocle, and like that'd be like a neat thing to be able to do. But then we look at the code and realize there's a lot of assumptions baked into his code base about how we do things at Chime. And it's not just things like, oh, we use GitHub rather than GitLab. Oh, we use, this CI vendor instead of that CI vendor. It's also issues of like, here's specifically how we deploy things into our production environment. And there's like this automation and tooling that we have in front of it. Like you don't have developers just like manually configuring things. There's YAML files, and those get processed by something, and then that gets processed by something, and that does like the CD deployment. And and Monocle is digging through those configuration files. Like that's not going to apply to anybody but us, because nobody else, like even if they're using the same third-party tools, they're not going to have exactly the same infrastructure. Or our rollout of the service-to-service authentication feature, that's a very Chime-specific feature, and a check for that capability like is meaningless to anybody else because they're not implementing, service authentication and authorization that way.
Yeah. Yep.
So if you're going to like try to open source that, you've got to figure out how to get all the stuff that everybody can use in one place, and then extract all the stuff that is going to be organization specific or need to be heavily configured, put that somewhere else and plug it in and configure it. And that's not an easy thing to tackle, unfortunately.
No, not at all, right? Like, I mean, the low-hanging fruit, it feels like there's quite a few things that'll do, that'll at least, monitor GitHub repositories, or, get repositories for a specific settings. And, that again, that's a good place to start. But this is why any organization needs product security, right? Like they've got to have some sort of at least a person that's looking at this and trying to automate these approaches. Otherwise it's not going to get to that level, right? Like we always talked about this, 5-6 years ago with Netflix and their paved path idea, right? Like it worked very well for them internally. They had a bunch of tools. But it's so hard to take that and push it to another organization without having the knowledge, Paul, that you're specifically speaking to. Because it's every environment is different. I mean, we see that from a testing perspective. We see that from an AppSec, a cloud security, a DevOps, a GitOps perspective. All of these different components just won't line up. So you've got to have some sort of context, somebody to actually glue that context together. I don't know, like, Paul, like specifically being in those different code bases, where would you recommend that someone start, if they're coming into an organization and trying to learn that?
Yeah, like I think kind of like what David was saying, like you start with the simple things and then you can build up from there. Like once you build, something that can like, oh, you have like this setting across all your GitHub repositories the way you want. Like once you have that tooling in place, then having more sophisticated checks can often be just a matter of, oh, if we integrate this other data source, then we'll be able to do something. Or, oh, if we dig like a little bit deeper into this resource that we're already looking at, like we might be able to figure out some extra things that we're interested in. If you're trying to like jump straight to like the hard stuff, like it's gonna take a while to get there. And a lot of these features like that I've been talking about like have taken a while to get working, because you have every organization is different. They all have their own ways of doing things, and then you realize that even the way we do things, there's actually a lot of variation within that a tool that's going across all the repositories and all the services is going to run into and have to deal with.
Yeah.
To expand a bit on that, if you ask yourself, what is in production, or is this in production, this service, this thing, maybe even this, does this get deployed to an S3 bucket, something like that? That's a pretty hard question to answer. Maybe that means you're integrating with your deployment system. And Paul's done a ton of work in this area, and I'm really thankful for his help. You're integrating with your deployment system. Maybe we haven't done this, but maybe you're even like looking at what IAM roles everything has access to and like tying that back to the repository to figure out if it's doing something, right? So there's a lot there.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways to take it, right? And I think where Ken and I got excited was actually seeing the results, the dashboard results that you guys were pushing back, that you were using things like Slack and GitHub pull requests and just notification, right? The gamification of it, and then also like allowing developers to compete against one another, right? They always want to be better than the other team. So along those lines, how has developer uptake and response been? I mean, I know you speak to a little bit in the article, but how did that start? How did it grow? What was your experience there?
Yeah, sure. I can talk about that. So when you first join a company, you're used to maybe a more approval-based company. And you think like, okay, I need to like ask for, is it okay for me to do this? Can I build this integration in this channel? Can I ping people? Can I do this and that? And I think when you're on the security team, you need to answer your own question and say basically, yes, I can ping everybody, as long as I'm respectful with it and not overwhelming them and things like that. So that was, I think, it's a very freeing moment when you do answer yourself, yes, let's do it. And, you start off small and the influence of your tooling grows over time, and, you dial back your alerts, you turn them back up, you see how people feel, and, you ask them how they're feeling. Are you feeling overwhelmed or not? And
so are you doing
and then
that?
You just land somewhere that works well. Yeah.
When you say you're asking them, is this like literally going DMing them on Slack, or is this part of the feedback that you're capturing through the tool?
So you certainly could build some kind of a feedback form. In our case, we didn't, because people are decently good at telling either our managers or us on Slack threads saying like, hey, this is really pinging me a lot. Also, when you set up your tool to send a particular message, you can add a phrase into the searches in Slack, and then you'll see whenever your bot is sending a message to a channel. And that's super helpful because then you can just watch those things. And, maybe after an hour or two has passed, you go look at all your notifications because they all show up as red little thingamajigs. And you can see people's maybe emoji reactions like, thanks, or maybe you get, worst case, maybe you get like a spam emoji reaction, and then you can like ask them like, hey, how can we make this better, right?
I like it. That's an interesting. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense because you've got access to. Yeah, I'm saying this because I think about this all the time. Is like, what's the as someone who builds a product, like, what's the right way? What's an approach that other people use to get that kind of feedback? And that is the benefit of having everybody sort of being in that Slack instance and seeing the feedback push to that Slack workspace and then being able to track it. That's pretty neat. One other question I had that's like a big one in my mind is I know you all have like a badge that you show within the repo to kind of surface its health, which does seem to be, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, tied to risk. And I guess the one thing I was trying to understand is in this scenario, what is your sort of risk matrix that you're using, or you know, is it different risk scoring per category of thing you're doing analysis on, and then you use an aggregate? Or just what was your sort of a thought and approach with surfacing and calculating risk?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's something that we've wrestled with a lot as we've developed Monocle. So the badges are based on what we call the security score, which is like a roll up of like, here's these different security checks we do. Like each one has like a point value assigned to it based on like how important it is that the repo is meeting that requirement or not. And then we would like sum them up, like figure out the percentage and say like, if you're at like this percent or above, you get an A, this percent or above, you get a B, and so on. So like as a first cut, like you can kind of like prioritize, like we're interested in there not being any critical or high vulnerabilities more so than maybe we're interested in like some hardening feature of the Docker images. Like we still care about it, but like we're going to penalize one more than the other.
I see.
That's like, kind of like the base level. And then you start thinking about, where it gets tricky. One of the things Monocle looks at is sources of vulnerability information about applications. So like vulnerable third-party dependencies that may or may not have a fix available through the Dependabot, or issues that our code scanning tools have flagged, and things like that. And trying to figure out how to roll that information up into a score. Because your goal is, I don't want any critical or high vulnerabilities. Okay,
Right.
so do we penalize if a repo has one critical that's unfixed? Is that better or worse than this other repo that has 2 highs? What about 3 highs? What about there's like you don't want you can't say like, every critical we're gonna dock you so much, because then eventually you're getting into a negative score, and that just doesn't even make a whole lot of sense percentage wise. But if you say, you need to fix everything before we'll bump your score up, then the downside of gamification then is the developer's going to say like, well, I'm looking at like this whole huge list of stuff I have to do before I can get any improvement in my score. Why am I going to bother? Where that's like definitely not something we want to incentivize the developers to think that way. So it's hard to figure out like how to adapt, like just the amount of vulnerabilities you have and factor that into a score in a way that's also like going to be predictable. And then another thing, like building beyond on top of that, which like is something we're planning in the future, is adapting that kind of risk information based on the overall risk posture of the individual service. So for example, a service that's handling sensitive data we might want to adjust the weightings of things differently from something that doesn't handle sensitive data, or something that is external facing versus something that's only used internally or only used by employees, and like have that kind of risk context available where you could say, okay, this vulnerability in a third-party dependency in the abstract is a high, but this is a mission critical service at the edge of our network. We're going to prioritize that, maybe at a critical level, whereas this critical vulnerability in some back-end service that's 5 layers deep in our network, and that isn't even reachable from customer traffic, maybe we're not going to treat that as a critical, because it'd be so much harder to exploit, and the impact in our environment is lower than it is just in the abstract considered by itself.
Yeah,
those are also those are difficult to figure out. We're thinking through how we want to tackle those now.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was actually something that, because so you're running this on all services too. So are there any services okay, so here's why I'm saying this, because you said sensitive services, right? That right there is huge to me, because not all services in your service catalog are created equal, and obviously your concerns are different, and what you're accepting of are very different. So to make this a short question, first question is, do you run this on all repos, or are there certain repos which equate as presumably exactly like a one-to-one mapping to a service? I assume. I mean, you might have monorepos or something like that, but I'm guessing a repo is a service. Are there any services you don't run this on? And if so, what would be the reason?
Yeah, we basically run it on all of our repos. We skip over the things that are archive repos that aren't under development, obviously. But yeah, we'll store everything, but then the main presentations we provide in Monocle is surfacing just the things that are running in production. We give the option to look at everything, but that also includes stuff that's a documentation repository, or things that are our services where they're not deployed yet, or stuff like that. So the scores look a lot worse there, because a documentation repository is not going to have dependabot enabled, for example. It doesn't really make sense.
Yeah.
And
right.
I don't, we mostly just focus on the things that are only focused on services that are getting deployed into production.
So when I was at GitHub, our tool, I forget how many, I think we followed the same amount of lines of code. There for the analysis engine. So when you push a code to a repo in GitHub and it shows you what the composition of the language is, there's a minimum set of criteria for even that function running to show what kind of code is in a repo. And we, on the security side, mimicked that same, those same little requirements to say this repo has been put online but doesn't have these controls, right? Because it met the minimum for it being considered a functional repo. And I don't know, I don't remember if it also had not just lines of code, but a package file or something like that. But are you doing something similar? Because I assume it has to be sort of an automated approach, because I assume, again, that people are probably putting on repos, or putting up repos rather, as needed, without too much friction there to get one running. And if that's the case, then obviously you need to be aware that has to be brought into the sort of Chime fold, or excuse me, Monocle fold.
Yeah, I think we do something along the lines of what you're thinking, where we automate the detection of what is getting deployed to production. So one of the things that Monocle crawls is the repositories that have our various continuous deployment setups for the production environment, so it can figure out here's the 30 set of 30 or whatever services that are making it a production, and then linking those to figure out, okay, these services are defined in these repositories, so these repositories are production, and so I need to scan them. And then of course a challenge is figuring out all the different ways that you deploy things to production. So one example we've got is you have your main services get in production this way, and you have tooling around that. Oh, but we also have these ML models that are running in deployed in a completely different way, and their CD is defined over here. And you say, okay, I'll add support for that. Oh, well, the real-time models are actually defined over there.
That was
okay, I'll do those.
such a challenge.
Oh, also there's
Yeah.
lambdas that get deployed now too.
Yeah.
It's like, oh,
Yeah.
well, so you're
And definitely not in the same way.
yeah, and hopefully there's maybe only one way they're deploying lambdas, but maybe not.
Yeah. Who knows?
That was
Through the
such a
console, yeah.
challenge for us. It's so
Well,
many
it's-
different ways that things get. Yeah, sorry, Seth.
No, it's not just you. It's not just, GitHub or Chime, right? Like everyone struggles with it's the idea of service app inventory, right? Like just knowing what's actually in production, cloud inventory as well, right? Like, okay, yeah, you think everything's deployed to AWS and then realize that some developers went out and like spun up a GCP instance or an Azure instance or DigitalOcean, right? Like, there's just so many different problems that you run into as far as just getting to know what your environment and what the context is that you look like, not to mention the risk prioritization that you're talking about, Paul, right? Like, what is it? How risky is it? Should we really be looking at it? So having some sort of a key that you're using to determine what it is fairly important, right? Anyway, so like, what was the approach that you took? Did you just, in that case, you started with, one set of, hey, we're pushing everything out via this one mechanism and just started to add more to the fold, or were the developers actually giving you that information?
Yeah, it's pretty much starting with the obvious ones, like your mainline services that are running in your Kubernetes clusters, and then seeing, sitting back and thinking, where are our gaps? Like, oh, we have these, the ML models that at the time we weren't scanning, but they are running in production and handling production data. So let's learn about how those are getting deployed and cover those as well, and kind of like going down the line of things where one trick I've used is just look at the list of what Monocle is saying is in production and looking at, was there anything that I know for sure is in production, but it isn't captured here? Why is that? And then that's served to help highlight, oh, here's things that are deployed in some other way, or there's some quirk about how they're deployed where they're tripping up the automation we have built out, and we need to fix a bug or two.
Yeah. Well, what was the pressure? Like, I mean, I know, David, we talked about the CSO that was, hey, brought you over to build, to help build out Monocle. And I blanked on his name all of a sudden. So sorry about that.
Jeff Trudeau. Yeah.
There you go. Jeff Trudeau. Yeah. I was going to say Jason something. I knew it started with a J. Anyway, so as he brought you over though, to do this, what was the expectation as far as like, hey, we're going to get all this on board? Like, the reason I ask this is I deal with a lot of organizations and I deal with a lot of executives, and that's always their complaint. They're like, oh, well, we need to be 100% like secure across the board, and we're going to start with this one little thing, but then they don't realize how long that's going to take, right? So what did that look like from an executive perspective?
Well, I guess our CSO is really cool, so I wouldn't say that he pressured us super hard on exactly how that would look. So I'll just describe kind of how the scores evolved. We have some simple ways in the beginning, some simple ways to determine, do we think this is in production? Because Rails services are the biggest population at Chime to start with. And then we come up with, let's say to start, maybe we had probably 6 score factors, and we just we came up with, hey, let's just have a score of 80% or better for production repos. Let's try and get everyone to that point. And then, so each score factor it's either passing, we just try to keep it simple. So it's either passing or failing. It has a point weight. If it's passing, it gets the full weight. If it's failing, it gets 0. So then as time passes and everybody's passing those, let's say, first 6 score factors, then you add a new one, and maybe you reduce the point value of a past one that everyone's already doing well. And you've got the homepage of your tool showing you how many people are in each grade bucket, or how many repositories are in each grade bucket. And then you can kind of see over time, okay, like everybody's security baseline is just going up over time. And then the executives, that kind of dashboard, or just those like top line numbers, how many Bs and above do we have? That's getting shared with the engineering leaders. And a big thing that we've been able to do recently is we've got another team that's tracking ownership. So they've built a whole app, like, this is a service, it's owned by this EM, this engineer, and it's in this group, and etc. That's been super helpful for us, because as you get bigger, you've got a lot of repos, and well, how do I know how my repos are doing? So you need that ownership to be able to look at your repos. And then our management needs to be able to see, okay, which group, which could be a bunch of teams, which group needs more security investment, and which VPs do we need to start pinging and asking them, hey, can you ask your teams to do a little bit better on this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the evolution. That's, you wouldn't start with that, but
yeah. I mean, it's always that, like, there's I always talk with people about the top down or bottom up approaches, right? And you kind of have to attack it both ways, right? So you've got to give the executive some sort of dashboard, something that they can use to see, like, oh, how do these different VPs, how do they compare? How do those groups compare? Who's actually ahead, who's behind, to give a little pressure from the top. But from the bottom, you don't want it all coming from the top, because the developers are going to resent that. So having the buttons and the badges, the other things that you are actually showing that they understand, is fairly important, right? Like, hey, there's these 6 things. You can go fix that.
Yeah. So like for every new control or thing that you're trying to track, you kind of go through a little bit of a decision diagram. Can we just fix it preventatively for everybody? That's the ideal case. And maybe can you even ask another team to build that for you, like a developer experience team, for example? Like, if we've got a service generator that someone's building, can we just have everything configured correctly in the beginning, so that we don't have to bother any engineers to fix those basic things? So there's that kind of thought process. And then there's also the thought process of, like, how hard is this to fix? If something is really hard for us to automate and fix preventatively, but it takes an engineer, 2 minutes to go in and fix that thing, like, let's say branch protection, then we want to prefer to ask a human to fix it than to try to spend a lot of our time automating something like that.
Makes total sense. It also makes sense to sort of first let the product get good, like have good, before you start having execs kind of pinged, or anybody sort of brought into the fold from the top down scenario that Seth was talking about. Just like allowing that thing to breathe, to evolve, to get feedback, to tune it, and to tune Monocle to a point where you do feel comfortable. Because like, I'd imagine if it were me, I would not feel good day one being like, okay, here's the thing I put out here. All right, now we're just going to have everybody report on how well they're doing on this thing. And if they're not doing well and not mitigating things, like, day one, we're going to report on that to the execs. Maybe you took a different, or feel a different way, but for me, that's part of that's, like, I guess, just product 101, just building that to feel comfortable first.
So if you're adding a new score factor, something you're grading people on, it doesn't have to have any points to start with. It could start with 0 points. Or you could add a new score factor, security score V2, and then add all the new stuff in there. And then once you're ready, then everyone moves to that one. I would probably prefer adding a new score factor that's worth 0 points, because it's just a little bit more incremental. There's no like day of the launch thing. Maybe
Yeah.
Paul wants to add to that.
Yeah, I was just saying, like we've tried both approaches now, and I think the start with a 0 weight score factor is a lot smoother to integrate than having like a new type of score that's like the next version and then switching that over to be the old one. You do like one big advantage of starting this, like being able to score something before it's ready, is that then you can like put some effort into getting that fixed across your different repositories before you start making it count for the score, because developers don't like being blindsided by, oh, my repository wasn't an A, now it's a C. Why that? No, because like we introduced this new thing that we hadn't really communicated very clearly with you, and it's worth a lot because it's important. Like, you get a lot of feedback when something like that happens. But if
I
you
bet
start
you
at
do.
like, yeah, but started at 0, and then you can say like, okay, like we're doing pretty badly on this overall because it's brand new, nobody's thought about this yet. We can like then engage with developers and let them know like, hey, we're working on this, like we'll help you out, like how to fix this for your repositories, or maybe do some kind of automation to do it across the board for a lot of them. Get that up to like around where we want to be, or at least close, and then have it start counting. So then you're starting off at a point where most people are already in a good state once it's like counting for real. And then it's not nearly as, as problematic for people when scores start to dip a bit, because like, there's been backsliding or something new or something like that comes up.
Okay, I mean that's a really intelligent approach. Yeah, you give people time to sort of respond. You also get to see how it's performing, through, like you said, going into Slack and sort of looking at the reactions that people are providing, as well as just the output of the tool. So you're giving everybody, not just them, them being the developers, but you're also your team, the chance to improve. So that's a really intelligent way. And actually, that's a part of the other question I had was, the way I see it, you all don't probably know this, but I've been on a little bit of this, like personally, security champion programs I'm in a weird spot with, because, and this is where I think Monocle actually really helps out. So I think what I've seen with security champion programs are, the intention is that a security champion would be somebody that would extend the security team's not just knowledge, but awareness, really, of, sort of like, hey, our team is going to develop this thing. Let's let you guys know about it. And here's the things that I know to be potentially pretty security sensitive as the security champion. And I've probably been involved in the architecture discussions leading up to how we're going to design, or the design discussions, and had input there. So that's kind of the security champion role. But then what I've seen it kind of morph into is they become more of like a canary in, the coal mine, kind of, and used in that fashion. And obviously, when a team's shipping a lot of code a day, right, like, that's not really just hoping that somebody's going to maybe happen upon a real vulnerability, or maybe they get an alert and maybe that thing is, from I don't know, some tool or whatever. The thing I think Monocle shifts to is taking this sort of it becomes kind of a canary to me. That's what it sort of is like saying like, hey, this is your security, that function of what has been, I don't know, intentionally or unintentionally placed upon security champions. Like, that's what Monocle can do, is like surface those risks and help out there. Do you, I guess is getting to my point, do you have a formalized security champion program, even if you're not calling it that? And if so, how does the tool play into that role of a more security minded person on the developer team, or security champion? Very long-winded way of asking that question. My apologies.
Yeah, I don't think we have any formal program like that. If we do, it's settled enough where it's evaded my notice. But yeah, I see how like a tool like Monocle can kind of serve a similar role of like being something that's always watching out for, like, across like everything that you're building, and be able to surface early any issues that come up in a way that is hopefully helpful and informative to developers, rather than coming across as like you're penalizing them for failing to do something. It's like a heads up, like, oh, like, I noticed your score dropped, like, here's something you can do to fix it and bring it back up. give them
I mean, that kind of
actionable information at the time when it's going to be most useful for them. And I thought that's kind of like what we're trying to achieve with a lot of the improvements we make to Monocle.
Yeah, and so that was what I was trying to figure out. It's like, do you even need, or have you even felt? And that's sort of like what I was thinking is that, because in my head, I'm questioning, would I even feel the need for, at least in the way that security champions have been used, would I need that program in a scenario like that? And the more I think about it, I'm like, well, not that function of a security champion. It'd be nice to have really, security minded folks on the development team just to be involved in, like I said, like whether it's threat modeling or design discussions or whatever, that's nice. That's great. But I think the real issue is just like risky stuff that's shipping and services that are not being maintained in a way that, we'd ideally like them to be. And that's so, all right. That pretty much answers the question. Monocle's hitting a lot of the notes that we use security champions for.
Yeah, a lot of, I will point, like, it can't do everything. Like Monocle is good at looking for the things that it knows to look at, which are going to be like typically like lower level, well-defined aspects of the program. It's not going to be able to detect like, oh, you've introduced this major application logic, vulnerability that, tools like Breakman or stuff are going to be fine because they don't understand like what the application is supposed to be doing. And that, like, I think you still need some, to have people who are security minded enough to recognize like, oh, like we're doing this weird authentication thing that's new, and maybe we need like to make sure that somebody takes a look at this and see if it's okay, or oh, we have to do this cryptography related thing now to interact with this third-party partner, and can somebody make sure that we're handling the keys correctly, or see if there's anything dodgy going on with how they want us to integrate. And
well,
there's limitations for how much a tool can do with that for you.
Yeah. Right. But one of the things that you're doing is you're taking away that like low hanging fruit, right? Like rather than having your team spend time on, hey, we're looking at the repositories and going into these settings and spending these 2,000 hours to actually get this detail, we let Monocle handle that and the developers handle it. So we can concentrate on cryptography, on application specific vulnerabilities, on the really, the high risk stuff. And that, I think that's the key to automation. That's the ideal that we want people to get to, or we want to get to when we're on these teams is, hey, we want to look at something that matters. And it doesn't mean that this low hanging fruit doesn't matter, because if it's not in place, we've still got to go fix it. So we've got to have something there that'll take care of that. Whether that is bug bounty program, whether that is a Monocle and we can automate this out for most of the things, or it's a security champions program, some technology, some person, something has to look at the low-hanging fruit and be able to take care of it.
So in your blog, you all said you're like, I think started with your one security person to 60 engineers, and I'm assuming it's more than that now. I would assume. Or at least as much as that. So that's a scalability issue. And to Seth's point, it allows you all to focus on the important stuff where maybe your crypto knowledgeable engineers to focus on, or whoever it might be.
Yeah. I wanted to share a couple things. But before that, I'm not exactly sure what our ratio is right now of security engineers to overall engineers, and we do have a product security review process, so people submit things and we meet with them, talk to them, and write up what the threat models are and what we want them to do before they're done with the feature. Regarding scaling, I think something that I would have liked to have done sooner, which we haven't gotten to yet, but that's to have an endpoint where people can send data to us, because I think a lot of these really complex workflows, like that Paul is describing about what's deployed and how does deployment work, those tools are in some places running just arbitrary code, but they've got all the information available right there. And if they were just to make maybe one API call to Monocle telling us, hey, my service name is this, my repository name is this, and I'm deployed in production, then we could save ourselves a lot of effort. And also people could onboard new score factors much more easily without us having to be involved in every integration. Maybe we still help with like writing the copy and deciding what what it is, but we wouldn't have to write a new API integration with some other tool. So to get your minds turning, we recently did an on-site where we did a tabletop exercise where there was an RCE in one of our services, and everybody's talking about, how are we going to triage this and figure out how did this spread to other services and things like that. So I would highly recommend doing an exercise like that. And as you do that exercise, just think about like how much you might be scrambling between all these different security tools, and you're not going to want to build all of that information into a tool, but it's definitely going to give you a really high level view of what information I wish I had about each service, and what do I need to prioritize my services. Because when you look at it from the tabletop exercise perspective, you're able to actually get way more specific about what you need. Service X hypothetically had this RCE, and so I need to know X, Y, and Z about service X. And you can't, it's really hard to imagine exactly what you need ahead of time until you're actually looking at one specific example. And actually looking at one specific thing really helps you de-scope everything you need to build. Because, oh, well, it's a Rails service. Okay, so we're only going to support Rails services at first. And it's on the edge. So we're only going to try to identify whether something is exposed to the internet, and et cetera. So that can really help you save engineering effort as you're building tools like this, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's key, right? Like, it's a good time to just like recognize, we've been going for an hour. I know we could probably dig into more and more specifics, right? Like, so I want to be cognizant of your time for sure. But that is a good place to kind of put a bow on it, is to start from where you're at, right? Like, what are the biggest things? Like, what is doing a tabletop exercise, doing a threat model, doing something that at least points you to that priority that you can start with is how you build this program, how you build these tools. So that's a good place to, at least like take a pause for a minute before we close things out. But being said, right, like, we do want to be cognizant of your time. Paul and David, thank you so much for joining us today to talk through it. I think there's a lot of good nuggets that are in there, like from the discussion that we've had today. But along those lines, right, like, is there anything that you want to bring up, to put a bow on it outside of what I've said? I guess we'll start. Paul, anything else that you want to add to that?
No, I think that's good advice. Like, look at, if you're trying to build out a capability like this yourself, like, think about what are the things that are most important to you, and like find some small piece of that, get started there, and then build up from there.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Good. And then, if people do have more questions, is there a place that they could go to? I mean, this is, your opportunity to, promote whatever you want, right? But where could people find you or talk to you about this further?
Yeah, David, I think you have a link that's a collection, like the stuff that we posted publicly about Monocle so far, and like the talks you've done about it.
Is that the one on your site, David?
I believe so.
Okay.
Here, I'll repost it here in a second here.
Yeah,
It should be
a bunch
this
of links, like
there
a
we
talk, presentation slides, a couple of links to the articles we've written. And in some of those, we've also got contact information where you can email security at Chime and, ask us questions about how we're doing things, and we answer people sometimes. When we feel like it. Most of the time.
Yeah. And I mean, as always, to the listeners, right? Like, we have that Slack channel that's available. Ken and I are fairly active on it, right? And there's no expectation, Paul and David, that you guys, are on there. I know everybody's got their own lives and their own busy jobs, but there's quite a few members of the community that do serve at other organizations that would be willing to chat about it. Or if you want to continue the conversation there, please join us. You can find that link on our website, appsec.com.
Are you attending any cyber conferences in 2024 at all?
I don't think I am currently.
Yeah, we do have a couple of chimers that have a couple of CFPs out for, I think, B-Sides SF, or maybe just B-Sides in general. So those would be something to keep an eye out on. And also definitely check out Overwatch. And I don't think we have anything public about it yet, but also access service. Those are a couple of things that probably you'll be interested to learn more about once we get some more information about it online. Overwatch already has a talk from B-Sides, so you could check that out.
Cool.
Perfect. I'm looking for it, and I'll put it into our Slack channel for those on our Slack.
Sweet.
Those
All right.
not written by us specifically, but coworkers. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, we know how it goes, right? So, well, good. Appreciate again the time and the insight into how to build this sort of a tool. If others pop up, we'll send them your direction. Ken, any last minute thoughts before we close out for today?
No, I just want to again thank you both. As you know, I was trying so hard to reach out to y'all to get you on this podcast. This was awesome. I could go for another 2-3 hours easy asking you questions. So yeah, just thank you so much for your time. Thank you to the listeners as well for theirs.
All right.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah. Thanks,
Thank
Paul.
you.
Thanks, David. All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening and being members of the podcast. Find us online, and we will have a happy holidays, whatever that looks like for all of you. I know that's this time of year, and we will see everyone in a couple of weeks. Thanks again.